Thank you again. This afternoon, or this talk, I'll be talking more on trauma and the negative impacts of adverse childhood experiences with respect to behavioral and substance addictions. My disclosures are unchanged since this morning. And I thought it would be helpful to think about the term addiction and how it's changed over time. It's derived from a Latin word meaning bound to or enslaved by, and in its original formulation was not linked to substance use behaviors. Going back several hundred years, it became linked to excessive alcohol use and then excessive drug use, such that by the 1980s, the DSM substance use disorder work group thought that addiction could be defined as compulsive drug use. However, going back to the late 1990s, people like Howard Schaefer proposed some core mechanisms or components of addictions, such as continued behavior despite adverse consequences, diminished or lost control, compulsive engagement, and a craving or an appetitive urge state that immediately preceded the engagement in the behavior. And if these could be considered as the core components, then perhaps the term addiction might be applied to a broader range of conditions. In the first part of this millennium, there were two articles in the journal Science that Constance Holden authored these articles. In the first, in 2001, she asked whether behavioral addictions existed and whether we could use new technologies like brain imaging to determine whether gambling and substance use behaviors showed similarities. And then in 2010, she authored the article Behavioral Addictions Debut and Proposed DSM-5, which heralded the reclassification of gambling disorder together with substance use disorders in DSM-5. So addictions have historically focused on substance use disorders, which have been largely male predominant, which has led to a more limited understanding of addictive behaviors in girls and women. And it's, I think, important for us, if we're going to be providing care for people, to consider these individual differences, such as those related to gender or sex. So one of the differences that has been noted between males and females is a telescoping phenomena. And this was initially described in the late 1950s for alcohol use behaviors and disorders. And subsequently it's been described for drug use disorders and then gambling disorders and other behaviors that are characterized by impaired impulse control and addiction. So this telescoping phenomena is that females, as compared to males, tend to initiate engagement in addictive behaviors later in life, but the time frame between the initiation and the development of a problem is foreshortened in females as compared with males, or telescoped. So this may relate to many different mechanisms, some of which are environmental, social, cultural, but could also reflect biological differences or some interaction between those. So if we're thinking about the different pathways that people might go through to develop addictive disorders, there have been some prominent theories in the addiction literature, including in the behavioral addiction literature. And one model is the pathways model that Alex Blazinski and Leah Nauer proposed now over 20 years ago. And it proposed three pathways that involved the behavioral conditioned pathway, an antisocial impulsive pathway, and an emotionally vulnerable pathway. And this third pathway may be particularly relevant for females as compared to males because, for example, if we look at the diagnostic criteria or the motivations for gambling disorder, for gambling and gambling disorder, that females are more likely than males to report gambling to escape from negative mood states like dysphoria, or depression. And when we look at these relationships on a population-based level, we see an interaction effect where the links between problem gambling severity and depression in women are stronger than they are for those relationships in men. And those data are shown here with respect to, this is a large population-based sample in the United States, the National Epidemiological Survey on Alcohol and Related Conditions, which surveyed over 43,000 individuals, now about 20-some years ago. But we found that as problem gambling severity increased, we saw that there was this steeper relationship with respect to depression in the women as compared to the men. So this pathways model may link to a number of other addictive behaviors, as something similar has been proposed for gaming disorder. So Lee and colleagues out of Korea have described an emotionally vulnerable, a socializing need, and an impulsivity aggression pathway for linking to the motivations for engaging in gaming behaviors that then may lead to gaming preferences and ultimately to gaming disorder. Now, in thinking about these gender-related differences, it's important, I think, to consider trauma and stress. Males and females often experience different types of traumas and stressors, with sexual assault and rape being more common in females as compared to males. And thinking about stress and trauma, they are a risk factor for engaging in addictive behaviors, and they may operate in gender-sensitive manners. So again, going to the NESARC data, and this I believe may have been from Wave 2, which was again a large sample, over 34,000 individuals. We found that gender moderated the relationship between stress and psychopathology. First, women as compared to men were more likely to report moderate or high levels of stress, and these differed in terms of the types of stressors. This relationship was particularly relevant to social stress and financial stress. Men were more likely to report work-related stress. And we found that in the whole sample, stress across the gender groups was associated with increased odds of both Axis 1 and Axis 2 DSM-4 psychiatric diagnoses, including depression, anxiety, substance use disorders, as well as the Axis 2 personality disorders. And we found an interaction effect where there were stronger relationships between stress and specific psychiatric disorders in women as compared to men, especially for anxiety, phobia, and alcohol use disorders, as well as cluster B and cluster C personality disorders. So other data link childhood trauma to addictive behaviors later in life, particularly for specifically for gambling problems, where sexual trauma has been linked to gambling problems, particularly in women. And the findings raise questions regarding the mechanisms by which this may be occurring. So we've also been interested in understanding the neural correlates of how people process stress cues. And when looking at gender-related differences in individuals without psychiatric concerns, we found that women as compared to men showed greater cortical responses to stress cues, whereas men showed greater subcortical responses in a way that linked to their subjective experiences of anxiety to the cues. So specifically, the blue-purple colors highlight the regions in which men showed greater reactions to stress cues. The red-yellow colors show where women showed greater activations than men to the stress cues. We saw an interaction effect gender by anxiety interaction effect that implicated largely cortical brain regions. And if we looked at these relationships, there were positive correlations to the stress-related activations and the subjective anxiety in the women, whereas these relationships were largely negative in men. So how might this relate to trauma? In a separate sample of adolescents, we found that those with high childhood trauma scores as compared to low showed differences largely in stress-related responses within largely cortical brain regions. So this also raises questions about how individuals with addictive disorders may show differences with respect to stress-induced and drug-induced cue reactivity. So this is now showing group differences in the women with and without cocaine use disorder to 3 types of cues, to stress-related cues, to drug-related cues, and to neutral relaxing cues. And in this drug-related cues, the control group was a group of active who had active recreational drinking, so they had an alcohol cue. The people with cocaine use disorder had a drug cue. And so what one can see is that the stress cue, the women with and without cocaine use disorder in the women is associated with a much more robust cortical striatal limbic activation than is the drug cue. And this is consistent with the notion that women who engage in addictive behaviors may do so in response to negative mood states that may be related to stress that can induce anxiety. We saw something different in the men, so I'm just going to toggle forward. It's going to be a similar slide, but showing the men, so the color difference will change. We can see that now the drug cue is showing a much more robust differences as compared to the stress cue. And again, in both men and women, there was a difference in neutral relaxing conditions. So what does this mean from a clinical perspective? Men may be more likely to engage in addictive behaviors due to the positive reinforcing cues or behaviors or motivations, whereas women may be more likely to engage for negative reinforcement motivations, and this is reflected in brain-related cue reactivity. Across both men and women, there is relatively increased corticostriatal limbic activation to the neutral cues, suggesting that people with addictions may not be able to get their brains into a more relaxed state as compared to people without addictions. And it suggests that perhaps some therapies like mindfulness-based therapies may be helpful for both men and women. So we've also begun to look at some of the transdiagnostic features, again using this connectome-based predictive modeling. And what we, in a principal component analysis, we found several different impulsivity-related factors, one being a punishment sensitivity, behavioral inhibition factor. And in the whole sample, the connectome-based predictive model was significant, but it linked to different behaviors in the men and women, and this is a sample of college-age students. What it linked to in the men was to alcohol use, so the greater punishment sensitivity, behavioral inhibition was linked to lower levels of alcohol use in men, but it was positively linked to negative life events in women, suggesting that this brain state that is linked to this transdiagnostic factor links differently to real-life situations in men and women. Now, how does stress and how do stress and other factors relate to gaming disorder? This is a study out of China, out of Macau, where stress was found to operate through metacognitive processes, both with respect to positive beliefs about worry and negative beliefs about thoughts containing uncontrollability and danger, to relate to escape motivations, so gaming to escape from negative mood states, that was then linked to the tendency to develop internet gaming disorder. Additionally, trauma has been linked in a separate study to internet gaming disorder, and it may operate through internalizing concerns like anxiety and depression, where childhood trauma has a direct effect towards internet gaming disorder, but then may operate through anxiety as well as particularly depression to link to internet gaming disorder. And these concerns, these mental health concerns, are common in individuals with internet gaming disorder. So a meta-analysis that looked at the relationship between childhood trauma and internet addiction more broadly found a positive relationship where more childhood trauma was linked to greater internet addiction, but more studies of higher quality were reported as being needed. So addictions often operate at a transgenerational level where parents who have addictions often have children who develop addictions. So we're interested in understanding some of these relationships on how addiction may impact parenting behaviors, particularly in mothers. And we proposed a model where by adverse childhood experiences may operate through several different pathways, a dopamine reward-related pathway, an oxytocin social and empathy-related pathway, and a glucocorticoid stress pathway to increase the susceptibility to addiction that may relate then to impaired maternal caregiving that may then link to higher likelihoods of adverse childhood events in developing children. So in some of these studies, we experimentally tested some of these possibilities. We studied mothers with substance use disorders, and the task involved viewing own or other infant sad and happy faces. And in healthy mothers without addictive disorders, the mothers tended to show an increased brain response in regions like the ventral striatum, in reward-related regions, to their own infant's happy face. And this was absent where we actually saw a relatively depressed ventral striatal activation, as well as a depressed ventromedial prefrontal cortical activation in the women with addictions, suggesting that mothers are not responding to their own infant cues in a way that women without, mothers without addictive disorders do. So based on this, we hypothesized in that model that perhaps we could increase responsivity to infant cues using pro-empathic, pro-social drugs like oxytocin, and this study is currently ongoing. But oxytocin may relate to other behavioral addictions in complex ways. So this is a study of men with treatment with problematic pornography use, and we collected measures of oxytocin and the related chemical arginine vasopressin. So oxytocin behaviorally is linked to prosocial behaviors, arginine vasopressin more to aggressive behaviors. And then we looked at the extent to which these measures, as well as psychiatric symptomatology, related to pornography-related hypersexuality in this group of men with problematic pornography use. What we found was that there were direct relationships, with the most robust being for psychiatric symptomatologies being related to pornography-related hypersexuality, but also a direct relationship, and positive in both cases, with arginine vasopressin. What we saw with oxytocin was somewhat different in that oxytocin was correlated with empathy, which was then inversely correlated with pornography-related hypersexuality. So it suggests that oxytocin may have important effects, as well as there may be other important neurochemical effects to consider with respect to intervening to help individuals with problematic pornography use. So if we think about this more aggressive type of behavior, this has also been linked to gaming and gambling in some very rare but high-profile incidents in the United States, where in one case, someone who was reportedly into heavy gaming went to a gaming tournament and killed some people, shot them and killed them. And then in Las Vegas, someone who was described as heavily gambling shot and killed a number of people at a music festival back in 2017. So we were interested in understanding this relationship between weapon carrying, gambling, and gaming in high school students in the United States. So we had collected data going back now 15 to 20 years, and these data included weapon carrying questions, and we found that among the high school students, weapon carrying was associated with more permissive attitudes towards gambling, perceived parental permissiveness towards gambling, more family gambling concerns, so someone in the family with a gambling problem, at-risk or problematic gambling in the high school student, and then relatively diminished associations between at-risk problematic gambling and gambling with other individuals like friends or family members or adults. And these findings taken together suggested to us that more socially isolated gambling may link at-risk problematic gambling behaviors and weapon carrying. And we saw something similar with respect to gaming behaviors, particularly among youth with high sensation seeking. So again, these findings taken together that perhaps by targeting isolative and sensation-seeking youth, and perhaps particularly males, it may prevent a number of concerns. So in the United States, there have been changes in legislation in gambling. So the Supreme Court of the United States in 2018 determined that the Protection of Amateur and Professional Sports Act, that this was unconstitutional, and it has led to states being able to legalize sports gambling. And so currently in the United States, 39 states since 2018 have legalized sports gambling, and most of these have also legalized online gambling. So this has led to what Time magazine within the last year has described as an explosion in sports betting, and how it may relate to gambling disorder. And a meta-analysis suggests that perhaps 1 in 10 college students has a gambling problem. And a lot of gambling these days is done online, and this is now a graphic over the 2021 to September 2023 period of monthly use of popular sports betting apps. And one can see marked by 5 million, 10 million, and 15 million, increasing over time from the gray color to the salmon color to the reddish-orange color. So this is a very prevalent, increasingly prevalent behavior. And this is also occurring in the setting of large sports gambling advertising being done in the United States. So it's now estimated that over $300 million per year is spent by the major gambling industry groups on television ads that often occur during sporting events, such that it's hard to watch a sporting event in the United States without seeing advertisements. And so this has led to people developing, in this setting, people have developed gambling problems. This is now the tale of a 33-year-old individual who reports that 99% of the gambling that he's done in the last 5 years has been on his phone. And one can bet on a wide range of behaviors, not just the outcome of the game, but on what the next play will be, or what color blouse Taylor Swift will be wearing at the Super Bowl, or many different things. And he says, now you can be sitting on the toilet and deposit an infinite amount of money into a gambling app. And he accrued over $200,000 in debt, contemplated embezzling to pay for the debt, and has gone into treatment to Gamblers Anonymous, seeing a therapist, and then handing over his finances to his mother. And he says that he still worries about relapsing every day. So should there be concerns about sports gambling in this setting of increased legalization, the sporting culture that is in the United States but elsewhere around the world, increasing media coverage such that platforms like ESPN not only highlight the betting lines, but also have betting-focused shows, and now their own gambling site. And there's the increased internet access. So in the United States, in my state, in Connecticut, what we've seen since about 1 year after the legalization of online sports gambling is that the calls to our gambling helpline have increased by about 90%. And this has largely reflected an increase in young men with gambling problems seeking help, with about 2/3 of the call coming from the male with the sports gambling problem, and about 1/3 from a concerned parent, usually the mother. So now there are other forms of problematic usage of the internet, and a study from Germany found that there were 3 groups, one with gaming problems, one with social networking problems, and one with other problems, including pornography viewing and shopping. While the social networking group was predominantly female, the gaming and the other groups were largely male. And the other group also was older, and the gaming group reported more hours on the internet. But I think importantly, it becomes increasingly challenging to define certain behaviors as one form of internet use given the convergences. So social casino games may reflect an intersection of social media, gambling, and gaming, where it's not officially gambling, but it has gambling-like elements, and microtransactions, which are paying for extended time or to reach higher levels, has been linked to more problems, including earlier onset of gambling and development of gambling problems. And then loot boxes and loot crates, which are random elements within video games, have been considered gambling in some jurisdictions and not others. And then there are other intersections as well. One of those intersections came about as a naturalistic experiment of sorts, where the Fortnite server crashed for about 24 hours in 2018. Fortnite being a popular video game. And Pornhub, a popular pornography website, reported that the percentage of gamers during the Fortnite crash increased by 10%, and searches for pornographic videos using the key term Fortnite increased by 60%. So there are these complex, nuanced relationships between these forms of internet use that warrant more understanding. And speaking with people in recovery from either gaming problems or pornography use problems, there is this overlap in problematic engagement in both areas. So when ICD-11 was being generated, gaming and gambling disorder were included as disorders due to addictive behaviors. But other forms of internet use, like social media or shopping and buying, were not included as specific disorders. And we've proposed that the designation of other specified disorders due to addictive behaviors could be used to capture, in clinical settings, people who have problems, to give a diagnosis to people with problems with social media use or other addictive behaviors that are not defined. So getting back to the gender-related differences, we, now going back 4 years, published a meta-analysis looking at gender-related differences with respect to different forms of internet use behaviors related to gambling, to gaming, social media use, or more general internet addiction. And what we found was that, like in the Hans-Jürgen Rumpf study, that there was a male predominance for internet gaming disorder, female predominance for social media addiction or problematic use of social media, and internet addiction had a slight male predominance but was more mixed. So if we looked at this country by country, that male predominant IGD, female predominant social media addiction is in the top left-hand corner. There were some countries that showed, one country that showed the opposite pattern in India, and then Taiwan and Germany showed male predominance for both behaviors. But by and large, this gender-related difference held across multiple jurisdictions. And the effect sizes are shown here for internet gaming disorder in the yellow color and for social media addiction in the blue color. Now, developmentally, we see differences going from childhood to adolescence with respect to high-frequency screen media activity. So we used two large data sets, the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study, which is a study of longitudinal study of over 11,000 children beginning at ages 9 to 10 and going through adolescence into emerging adulthood. And these are data from the first several waves, so the groups being of ages 9 to 10 to up to 11 to 12. And what we saw in the high frequency group is shown here in this orange color, where it was largely a video-centric pattern of high-frequency screen media activity as compared to a low-frequency screen media activity as determined by a machine learning approach. But to see if this pattern replicated in the Human Connectome Project development data set, we needed to divide the group into those ages 5 to 12 versus those 13 to 21. And in the 5 to 12 group, we found a similar pattern as shown in this high-frequency yellow line. But in the older group, the 13 and above, it was largely a socio-communication-centric high-frequency pattern. So, and this is texting and social media use. So it suggests that as children move into adolescence, there is more high-frequency screen media activity shifting from more video focused to more socio-communication focused. And in the United States, if we look at this second group of teenagers, high school age, 13 to 17 years, most have access to a smartphone. So 95% have access to a smartphone. And over the past decade, the proportion of teenagers who report being online almost constantly has essentially doubled from 24% in 2014 to 2015 to 46% over the past couple of years. And of these specific apps that are used by teenagers, YouTube, TikTok, Snapchat, Instagram are the most frequently reported. Facebook by fewer. Facebook is largely seen as an older person's app. But it's interesting that like TikTok has been introduced within the last decade, and it has risen in terms of popularity of use. And if you look at the proportion of youth who are using these specific apps, and then the proportion that is saying that they're online almost constantly, TikTok has the highest ratio of online almost constantly to those who are using it. So it raises questions about what are the mechanisms by which TikTok may be capturing the attention of developing youth. Maybe it's the short video format or the For You page or the endless scrolling or other features, but I think it's important to understand these differences and to be able to dialogue with youth to reflect an understanding and an appreciation of the positive things that they may be getting out of engaging in these sites, but also the negative impacts. So, and this may be particularly relevant for girls if one looks, for example, at TikTok. If you look at the proportion who are saying that they're online almost constantly, there's a gender-related difference that's substantial for TikTok. And this may relate to some of the concerns that people have raised, including the U.S. Surgeon General, about how social media use may be impacting youth mental health. And an advisory was put out last year on this topic. And more recently, he published an opinion in the New York Times where he's called for product warning labels to be put on social media sites like they are already for alcohol and tobacco products. And as I mentioned in the question and answer period during the first talk, the EU has undertaken regulatory changes with respect to internet platforms and has levied some large fines for violating data privacy rules. Now, in Canada, I also mentioned Prime Minister Trudeau with respect to their having been callers for tougher actions against Pornhub. MindGeek, the parent company, is located in Canada. And he laid out a plan for a new regulatory framework that would curb illegal content online. But there was also pushback from the industry saying that this would have multiple concerns, including impacting how much Canadian creators could earn. And more recently, Pornhub, as this bill has been approved, Pornhub has pushed back, saying that they should be exempt from this law because pornography doesn't have any societal or cultural value, and thus Pornhub should be exempted from the law. So in this setting, we've also engaged in a cooperation in science and technology initiative that has focused on problematic use of the internet. We started this effort prior to the pandemic. During the pandemic, we put out guidances with respect to how to prevent problematic internet use during the pandemic. Some of the guidance had general recommendations about taking care of oneself, healthy sleep, exercise, hydration, hygiene, finding relaxation to relieve the stress from the onset of the pandemic, engaging in social activities, having family time, but also personal time and space, and keeping informed about how the pandemic was unfolding. There were also specific recommendations about screen time in terms of self-monitoring and regulating one's own screen time to model that behavior for children and to monitor the children's behaviors, to consider digital well-being apps, but also to consider the use of analog tools. For example, if people were using their phones to check the time, but were then being triggered and engaging in problematic use of the internet, to consider non-digital technologies to check time, and then to seek help as needed. During the pandemic, we also, as more information was coming out about mental health, we had another article that provided an update. Then I also mentioned we have an e-booklet, Learning to Deal with Problematic Usage of the Internet. It can be downloaded at this website. It's also at the International College on Obsessive Compulsive Spectrum Disorders website, and it's been updated since the initial publication in 2020. There's a more recent version. And it covers multiple types of problematic usage of the internet, including some of the areas that were discussed, as well as others like cyberchondria, which is searching for health-related information in an excessive and anxiety-producing fashion, and cyberbullying, which is being aggressive on the internet in a bullying fashion. It also provides information on the course of problematic use of the internet and co-occurring disorders that also include neurodivergent disorders like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and autism spectrum disorder, and provides practical tips. So some of those practical tips for parents are listed here with respect of age-appropriate content, age-related introduction of digital technology devices and apps, and age-related durations of engaging in screen media activity to balance screen and physical activity time, no screen time or digital devices in the bedroom, screen-free meal times, turning off digital devices when not in use, avoiding the use of digital devices for emotional regulation. And I think this is particularly important because this is one of the factors that most strongly links to problematic usage of the internet and may be particularly relevant for females as compared to males. To create tech-free zones, have clear and consistent rules that both the parents and the children will follow. And if one is going to play video games, to play video games with others and not in a solitary fashion and not with strangers. And this relates in part to some of the data that came out of the pandemic, where we started a longitudinal study of middle school students in China right before the pandemic, and the second and third waves were during the onset of the pandemic. And what we found was that problematic gaming before the pandemic led to subsequent psychological distress during the onset of the pandemic, but problematic smartphone use at wave 2 led to psychological distress at wave 3 and not problematic gaming, suggesting that the context of the pandemic may be impacting how youth are experiencing the behaviors, and perhaps that youth were using gaming for more of a social activity during the pandemic. And then other tips included warning children about online dangers, encouraging to ask for help when cyberbullied, teaching online ethics, manners, and safe behaviors, as well as modeling behaviors for youth. So we're now working on a Lancet Psychiatry Commission report on problematic usage of the internet. There was a commentary that was released about a month ago in Lancet Psychiatry describing the work, and we hope to have the full report in about a year. And we also have a handbook on digital technologies and mental health that was published now 4 years ago. And so in conclusion, addictions in girls and women appear disproportionately related to stress and trauma as compared to boys and men. Biological studies suggest that females and males process stress differently, with women processing more at a cortical level, males at a subcortical level, with implications for addictions and the motivations that may drive engagement in addictive behavior. And then if we're going to break the transgenerational transmission of addictions, this may involve targeting stress and social processing and positive and negative valence pathways. So we think that these are all important efforts if we're going to improve personal, familial, and public health. So I also would like to note that we have a forthcoming ISAM, International Society of Addiction Medicine meeting in Hamburg, Germany in May of 2025. And there will be a pre-conference innovations day that talks about new treatments. We also have the 10th International Conference on Behavioral Addictions that will be held in Nantes in France in July of 2025. And then the Children in Screens group is organizing another Digital Media and Developing Minds International Congress in Washington, D.C. later in July. So I'd like to thank a large number of individuals, funding agencies, and thank you for your attention, and happy to take questions. Okay. So, so the question is, why did, in the United States, did the Surgeon General come out to tell adolescents in the nation that social media are dangerous? So I think it's very helpful that the Surgeon General has advocated for this. I think there have been other people who have been advocating for there to be tighter legislation and regulation of digital technologies and groups. If people have not seen the documentary, The Social Dilemma, I would recommend it. In this documentary, it highlights how people who are in the tech industry left the tech industry because they had ethical concerns about some of the behaviors that the tech industry was employing to engage individuals in some of the algorithms that were being used. So I think there have been concerns that have been raised by different groups over time, and I'm grateful that the Surgeon General has weighed in on this. So from an addiction perspective, how problematic are mobile games with time-based reward systems that encourage users to log in at specific times for rewards? And I would say that this is a complex phenomenon. So how are we defining rewards? Sometimes with, if we look at the DSM-5, and the focus was largely on when internet gaming disorder criteria were developed, there were massively multiple online role-playing games that were particularly popular, and there were social rewards as well as working together as a team and working across different time zones such that people would log in at odd hours in order to complete the games. There are now mobile games that also produce rewards for logging in at specific times, and this is an important phenomenon to understand better as to what is driving engagement in the behavior, and perhaps more importantly, what is driving problematic engagement in the behavior. So the question is, isn't it already proven that gaming doesn't lead to violent behavior? So this is a heated topic, and probably if one looks at all of the data, there is a relationship between gaming and violent behavior, but the relationship is weak and it varies across studies. But there are some individuals who are very against the idea of there being a relationship between gaming and violent behavior, and there are others that are more strongly suggesting its link. But I think with gaming and violent behaviors, there's maybe the best data suggests that there is a small link, but there are also other factors that play important roles. So trying to understand what those factors are, whether it has to do with social disadvantage or other trauma or other factors, we need to understand better. And it looks like the questions have gone away, so thank you very much.